title is Church Strategies for Overcoming Addiction. Now, this plastic bottle right here was laying on the edge of our church property. when I went over there, and this had been some time ago, nothing had been done as a matter of fact, but it was laying right there. And of course, you find that type of thing scattered around. I'm going to begin reading in Romans chapter 7, verses 15 through 20, and if you will follow along with me, please. This is from the New King James Version of the Bible. For what I am doing, I do not understand. For what I will to do, that I do not practice. But what I hate, that I do. If then I do what I will not to do, I agree with the law that it is good. But now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For the will is present with me, but how to perform what is good I do not find. For the good that I will to do, I do not do. But the evil I will not to do, that I practice. Now if I do what I will not to do, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. Notice from the words of Paul. Now this is Paul, whose name is on one of the foundations of heaven. This is Paul, the great apostle. This is Paul. Some people will say the greatest Christian that ever lived. This is Paul. And he said, I do not understand what I'm doing. Have you been that way? It's like, oh man, what is wrong with me? This is why he doesn't understand. What I know I should do, I don't practice. Isn't that the hard thing? The hard thing's not doing a good thing now and then. The hard thing's practicing the right thing, correct? But what I hate, that I do. Now, have you ever heard somebody say, if you didn't want to do that, you wouldn't do it? Paul said, I do what I know I shouldn't do. I do what I hate. And then he said, in my flesh nothing good dwells. Remember that. Nothing good dwells in the flesh. He said, I have the will to do the right thing, but how to do it, I can't find. He said, for the good that I want to do, I do not do. And the evil I will not do, that I practice. I want you to understand that Paul said, I do not only do wrong once in a while. He said, I practice. You're never going to get to the place as a Christian that you're out of the sinful state. You're never going to get to the place as a Christian where you don't have trouble with things in your life. Have you ever said, I have often thought, I'm 64 years old, I've been saved 57 years. I have often thought that to have been saved for 57 years, I should be a lot better Christian than I am. Well, maybe you felt the same way as well. The information I'm going to share with you today comes from the Scripture, my involvement in recovery groups and personal observations, teaching DUI schools, and while I'm dealing primarily this morning with substance addiction, the principles that we're going to share apply to all types of addictions. And by the way, I treat alcohol and illegal substances alike in general. Something to remember is that addiction of various types may affect many areas, may be involved in many areas of life. But all addictions are not as costly as others. Okay? And let me just, for example, if you take the damage that is done by illegal drugs, it is dwarfed by the damage that's done in our society by alcohol, which is dwarfed by the damage in our society done by nicotine. Especially when you consider health concerns, whatnot. Now here's the thing. But if you use nicotine, smoke, or dip, or whatever, chew, whatever you do, you're probably not going to get fired from your job because of that. But you might if you use illegal drugs. You're probably not going to lose your marriage because you enjoy a cigar once in a while. But you might if you blow all your money on illegal drugs. So what I'm saying is this. There are a lot of different things people can be addicted to, but not everything is as damaging in the life as the other. We'll say a word to parents. By the way, this picture was taken at one of our picnics a few years ago. Word to parents. There are a lot of parents that feel extremely guilty because they have children that are involved in some type of addiction. And I hope that if you're in that category of struggling with that, I hope that my comments are going to help today. We live in a time when everybody's looking for somebody to blame, which is part of the problem. The parents blame the school system, and the school system blames the parents. And then we blame the community, and everybody's looking for somebody to blame. One of the hallmarks of the recovery industry is to take control of your own life. See, you can't control everything that's in your life, but you have more control in your life than any other person. Parenting is a guilt trip. By that I mean whatever your kids do wrong, parents always feel like it's their fault. Oh, if I'd only been a better mother, or if only I hadn't worked so much. And we're always going down that line. There's a tendency to assume guilt, even for things that are not your fault. How many of you have been in an automobile accident sometime and you said, as part of what your thinking was, you said, I should have left 10 minutes earlier. Then I wouldn't have been here at this time, right? You know what you do? So there's a tendency to assume guilt. And I don't want parents to feel guilty about the things that their children do. Because your children are free moral agents, particularly when they get to a certain age. They pushed him straight against the wall. The firing squad stood in a row. And while he stood on tiptoes, those men will never know. He wore a smile upon his face as he stood primly there, the guns straight pointing at his heart, the wind upon his hair. For he remembered in a flash those days beyond recall, when his proud mother took his height against the bedroom wall. I know all kinds of parents that they're saying things like, he was such a sweet little boy. Or she was such a kind little girl. What did Paul say? Paul said, I don't understand what's going on. Let's go over some definitions, some things that define addiction. What is addiction? Addiction is a term that's used to describe severe problems related to the compulsive and habitual use of mood-altering substances. I said mood-altering substances. You could apply it to anything else. You could apply it to gambling or sexual behaviors. As a condition, addiction is primary. It is chronic and progressive, with genetic and psychosocial and environmental factors influencing its development and outcomes. It is recognized as a chronic disease in that it must be treated, managed, and monitored over a person's lifetime. Okay? There are some people that have an addiction of some type, and they do experience a life-changing event that sort of does it for them, but for most people, that's not true. For most people, they have to manage it over the lifetime. Kind of like a disease like diabetes, you got it. You have to manage it. And by the way, that is a chronic condition. A chronic condition is something that you get and you never stop having it. Okay. I said addiction is a primary condition. As a primary condition, it involves compulsion, loss of control, and continued use despite negative consequences. You guys all heard the joke that, where the guy went to the doctor and said, "Doc, my shoulder hurts whenever I do this." He said, "Well, don't do that no more." Here's the thing. In most areas of life, when bad things start happening, we stop it, right? Not if a person's addicted. They don't. I said addiction is a primary condition. By that we mean that it's not caused by another problem. There's all kinds of people that say this: "It's no wonder that I drink. Wouldn't you drink if you were married to you?" You see what I mean? People always putting off, the kind of job I got, I need a release, that type of thing. But addiction is not caused by another problem, and once it begins, it's the primary disorder that needs to be treated. It's the main thing. It's what has to be treated. Addiction is also progressive, and by that I mean it does not typically go away or decrease in intensity. It just typically gets worse and worse and worse. Now, by the way, not all substances or activities are addicted to the same degree. That's one of the things about methamphetamine. And methamphetamine is not even as consequential to the health as there are as some other illegal drugs are. But methamphetamine produces such a high for people that it is addictive to a greater degree because of that type of thing. Addiction involves poor control over use. By that I mean it involves poor control over the amount consumed, it involves poor control over stopping, and it involves poor control over behavior. Addiction also involves preoccupation or obsession. And that preoccupation with the addiction causes people to ignore important problems and responsibilities. And addicts can't get the object out of their head. It is always there. And they may not have time for anything else. I knew a woman a few years ago that had a drug habit of $700 a day. Can you imagine waking up in the morning and having no job and having to come up with $700 that day? You say, "Well, if that was me, I'd quit." Not if you were an addict. Addiction, I said, involves use despite negative consequences. What kind of negative consequences? Well, consequences to your health, your stability, your working life, your family, your finances, and your spirituality. Addiction also involves denial. What denial is a psychological defense system that we all have. Denial is mostly an unconscious thing, and that means that people that are in denial are not lying, and they may not be aware that what they believe to be true is not actually true. Denial takes many forms, including blame shifting. I said a while ago, it's not my fault that I got this problem. It's your fault, because you put me in that place. Addiction, by the way, differs from use. There are some people, as far as substances are concerned, that use alcohol or other drugs sometimes for years and never develop an addiction to it, or not to the same degree as some other people. And when people become addicted, good intentions are not enough to break the grip of addiction, not even religious ones. Now, you've heard it, and I've heard it too. People will be encouraged to make that one decision for Jesus and take care of everything else. That is generally not true when it comes to addicts. And I speak about it from time to time. Listen, you don't just need to make a decision for Christ at one point. You need to keep making decisions. You need to stay on your knees. You'll never get to the place today where you prayed up. You don't need it tomorrow. Paul said, I die daily. If Paul had to die daily, then I do and you do as well. And shame will not break the grip of addiction. A lot of people's families and other people say, aren't you ashamed of yourself? Aren't you ashamed of yourself? Yeah, they are. They are. Didn't it sound like in Romans 7 that Paul was ashamed of himself? See, you can't threaten an addict with death because a lot of addicts would rather just soon be dead anyway. The old thing they always tell about the addict is the addict walks into a trap house, sees somebody laying dead on the floor, and says, I want what he had. Addiction, there's a school of thought that says addiction may be rooted in a sense of loss. That may be true because it could be said that if we're all perfectly balanced and had everything like it ought to be, none of us would have any desire for addiction. That could be said, might be true. But I'm going to say in general, when a sin enters your life, generally that sin is filling a spot that's there. And addictions cut across the fabric of society. They say, why is there so much addiction? Well, it's because there's so much poverty. Really? Is that the reason? There's so many poor people? That's like blaming crime on poverty. You do know that most poor people don't steal, right? But that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? We think if people had money, they wouldn't need to steal. Well, most people don't have any money, don't steal. So you can't say that. There's a saying, by the way, that says, when you get rid of the addicts, who's left? And many people struggle with the same issue for decades, and that's common. That's common. And the disease model for dealing with addiction is correct. Now, there's a whole lot of religious people say it's not correct because it's a choice, and yada, yada, and I understand that. But what is true is that once an addiction takes root in a person's life, it behaves like a disease. In that it doesn't get better, typically. It typically gets worse. You have to monitor it. What did Paul say? He said, what I don't want to do, I practice. I have to deny myself and die to myself every day. That's a description of the life of a Christian person. Okay, I want to give you some aspects of addiction with regard to substance abuse. And the first is that addiction is a health problem. Many diseases are lifestyle-related health problems. A couple of diseases that fit under this category are heart disease and diabetes. Now, heart disease, everybody gets heart disease. All it means is that you're wearing out. Okay, that's just common. When somebody says you got heart disease and you're as old as me, you don't have to gasp over that. We're all losing a little bit, as we go along. It just means you're wearing out. However, if you live a healthy lifestyle, you won't develop it as soon, or it won't be as severe if you don't live a healthy lifestyle. Same thing with diabetes. There are people who live successfully with diabetes their entire lives. There's other people that don't give a hoot about what the doctor says, and they have continual problems all throughout their lifetime. So addiction is a health problem that's related to the lifestyle. Every disease has a trigger letter. Every disease. And by the way, everybody's at risk for for any disease. All of us are. There's no such thing as a life that doesn't have risk in it. It's impossible to eliminate risk from life. Now, I know all kinds of people who are agoraphobic and they don't want to go out of their house because they might get hurt, something might happen. That's true. Something might happen. You know, we could all get in an automobile accident on the way home. You know, you cannot eliminate risk from life. But what we can do is we can diminish our risks. Now, the risks that we can change or that we can't change is the risks that have to do with our body and our biology. Some people are predisposed to certain diseases, and some people are predisposed to addictions as well. You can't change your body, and you can't change your biology. The risks that you can change are your choices. And we can diminish our risk by making good choices. Now, when we pass the trigger level for any disease, bodily, we become, we develop that disease. And you go to the doctor, and the doctor says, you pre-diabetic. And you say, oh no, doctor, got diabetes. No, I didn't say you got diabetes. I said you're pre-diabetic. Start watching your food and intake and everything, and then maybe you won't become diabetic. So you start watching it, and it backs down a little bit. Okay? And that's the way it happens with addictions. If we make good choices, low-risk choices, the propensity that we develop an addiction diminishes. But if we pass the trigger level for an addiction, we develop that addiction, just like when a person passes the trigger level for disease, they develop that disease. And high-risk choices make us more likely to develop a condition and to develop more quickly. And low-risk choices make it less likely that we develop any kind of addiction or propensity toward any sin or an obsession with anything that's unhealthy for us. Now, low-risk choices, by the way, are not the same for everybody because everybody's got a different physical makeup. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit, but it's not the same for everyone. Now, when a person develops a disease, prevention guidelines don't apply to them. They need recovery guidelines. And when we are not addicted to something, we can prevent getting there. But once we get there, we need recovery guidelines and not prevention guidelines. Now, so addiction to substances is a lifestyle, health-related problem. There are a plethora of psychological and social influences that go into addiction. Now, most people do not see themselves the way that we characterize addicts. But the thing is, it's not the kind of person you are that determines whether or not you get addicted to something. It is the type of choices that you make. Listen, there are some people that have fine qualities that have got addicted to something in their life because they made certain choices. It's not the type of person that you are. Now, an interesting thing is that addiction to substances tends to run in families because of the increased biological risk. There's been adoption research done in Denmark, Sweden, and the United States where they took children that were born to parents who did not drink and had them raised in alcoholic homes and then vice versa. And what they found out is that the genetic makeup of the child had more to do with whether or not they developed a substance abuse problem than the type of environment they were in. And so, by the way, I've got an idea that there's certain things about the sinfulness in your life that has to do with that genetic makeup itself. Now, we don't know everything about how DNA and biology affects the things that we do. But have you not noticed that some people have trouble with certain things and other people don't have trouble with that? Right? You know? And if we don't have trouble with that thing, it's easy for us to say, they ought not be doing that, but the finger points back at us as well. So how you are made up goes into whether or not you have an addiction. Alcoholics are at 4 times greater risk for drug addiction, by the way. But sets a trigger level for developing any type of addiction, and that biology interacts with our choices. You will not become addicted to cocaine if you never use cocaine, even if everybody in your family is addicted to it. Okay? Now, biology is not a deadlock for addiction, but it increases risk. Twin research is informative on that. Fraternal twins have 50% of the same genetic makeup. That's just like any other brothers and sisters. But identical twins have 100% of the same genetic makeup. But what they have found is that even though identical twins are more likely to develop addictions, if one has it, the other is more likely, they found that that's not a deadlock. So don't ever say, everybody in my family has trouble with this, so I have trouble with it too. That's not going to be an excuse that you're able to use. And alcoholism has a 50% probability in identical twins, even though they have 100% of the same DNA makeup. Now, addiction is not only a lifestyle-related health problem, it's also an impairment problem. With regard to substance abuse, impairment has to do with the tolerance level. The trigger level has to do with using to a certain point till you get addicted. The tolerance level has to do with how much a person can use before they become addicted. Now, people are born with an initial tolerance level for substances that increases with use over time. And when I say a tolerance level, I mean a certain level that people can use of any substance before they pass out, start slurring their speech, stumble around, and having other difficulties. And as people continue to use a substance, their tolerance level increases. By the way, the average blood alcohol content level at a rest is 1.5. Now that may not mean anything to you, but what it is twice the legal limit. Which means there's a lot of people that have done a lot of drinking that are on the road at any time. Generally what they say is about 1 in every 10 cars has somebody that's been driving while impaired. Now, tolerance for substances is a liability. Now, I say that because drinkers will think that, or users of other things will think that tolerance is a good thing. What a lot of people will call that is they'll say things like, he can handle his liquor. Right? That's what they'll say. But tolerance makes people less sensitive and less aware. And anybody who's been around people who use substances knows that they generally think they're more in control of themselves than they are. Now there's mental impairment and there's also physical impairment. Mental impairment begins sooner than physical impairment and it increases more slowly over time. So as people begin to use the substance more and more and more, their level of physical tolerance increases, but the mental tolerance doesn't increase that much, and it's that mental impairment that causes the biggest problems for folks that are users of any type of substance. And it's the mental impairment that touches on decision making. You ever heard of anybody that had a substance and used, or at least partially responsible for a crash, and they hit a tree and it's the only one in the field? That'll happen. Well, there's a tug of war between the higher and lower brain function in addicts. Now, by the way, don't ever think that an addict doesn't think they need to quit. They do. And don't ever think that an addict does not mean to quit someday. Okay. I've asked many people, I said, you want your son to have this? No. You'll be this way till you die? No. They always mean to change. Don't you always mean to change every time you confess to sin? Good intentions, not to ever do it again, but it's there. There's a difference between alcohol and illegal drugs, and the differences are that drugs have lower trigger levels. Straight drugs are also have unpredictable strength and purity, and the standard dose of drugs is impairing. When I say the standard dose of alcohol is a half ounce of alcohol. That's what's called a drink. Whether it's in a beer, whether it's a shot glass or a glass of wine, a drink, that's standard dose. A shot of a drink of alcohol will not make anybody drunk unless you put it in a baby bottle or something like that. Okay? but the standard dose of drugs is impairing. Let me say this about alcohol. 70% of those who drink consume 10% of alcohol sales in the United States. What does that tell you? That tells you most people who drink don't drink very much. Okay? 30% of the drinkers in the United States consume 90% of the alcohol sales. Now, so addiction is an impairment problem. It's a lifestyle-related health problem. Addicts manifest distinct characteristics. And so here's some of the personality traits in people that become addicted to things. And you're going to see yourself in some of these things, whether or not you're addicted to something or not. Think about this. Number one, addicts tend to be sensation-seeking. And many social factors point to alcohol and drugs as a way to enjoy yourself. And ads, by the way, are a big deal. Now, you may not understand exactly how that works. I don't know everything that's involved in it. But I do know that in the first year of the Absolute Vodka campaign, you've seen them on the back of magazines where it'll be the shape of the vodka bottle. In the first year of the Absolute Vodka campaign, sales went from $54,000 to $2.4 million. People use substances for fun and to deal with stress, and the amount is the thing with regard to alcohol. A 50-year study, by the way, showed that alcohol caused more emotional problems than it solved. A lot of people will say, I'm depressed, that's why I drink. That may be part of it, just to be honest. However, it generally doesn't help. It generally makes things a little worse. They tend to be impulsive. By the way, sometimes impulsive people come in handy. Back me up just one on that. People that will do things quickly and are not afraid to act. An impulsive person, when the house is burning down and everybody's calling 911 or standing on the sidewalk wondering what to do, an impulsive person will run in that house and save a little child. Sometimes impulsive people come in handy. But they also tend to be gregarious, that is, they like to be the center of attention, and they also tend to be rebellious. By the way, that's not all bad. Sometimes you have to be a little rebellious to be able to get along. Even as a Christian, you've got to be willing to go against the grain. That helps sometimes. The personality trait of psychopathic deviant that's found in 2% of the male population and less than 1% of the female population is the same personality trait that would enable a person to win the Congressional Medal of Honor or to be very successful in business. It's not a mental health thing. It's a personality trait. You see, a person that wins the Congressional Medal of Honor in battle, they're going to be doing something that the average person wouldn't do, right? But those tend to be the characteristics. You might even see some of those in yourself. Now, what happens to a person that is addicted to substances or some other activity? There's a rewiring of their brain. Our brains work on the principle of dominant image. And by that, I mean that something we think about a whole lot, we get to where we can't think about anything else. Okay, remember I said addicts can get use out of their mind or that endeavor, whatever it is. See, the thing is this, I can see all of you folks if I hold my hand out here, if I hold it right here, I can't see any of you. And that's what happens. Our brains work on the principle of dominant image. And so that has a lot to do with the, garbage in, garbage out type of thing, whether or not we need to pray, whether or not we need to spend time in God's Word, whether or not we need to meditate on things that are good. In addicts, the part of the brain that's dedicated to survival gets rewired to sensations. By the way, that's true to all of us in some sense, because the average person is not in many life-threatening situations on a regular basis. So we don't need that survival part, not to the same degree. Katie Lang said, or sang, my old addiction changes the wiring in my brain so that when it throws the switches, I am not the same. And the addicted brain causes a person to use again and again and again. People become addicts, they're out of control. And that they feel out of control. A lot of addicts don't feel like they can do anything about their condition. And many addicts will view their compulsions as being untreatable. because they become less sensitive to sensitive pleasures, like sitting on the front porch and looking at the sunset, and they become preoccupied with only that high that they receive. And they become more sensitive to certain stimuli. And this may not mean very much to you, but it does to some people. However, your brain has a great ability to rewire itself, the plasticity of the brain. And if some of you today, you don't even feel like you're the same person that you were years ago because you think completely different. And you act completely differently. Addiction has a tendency to process through stages. The stages are, phase 1 is take it or leave it. That's people that don't get addicted to anything, and particularly substances. It has a relatively minor place in their life. Phase 2 is the phase of anticipation, where people start using the substance or the activity for fun. That becomes what they fall back on. During this time period when people start using substances for fun, women who drink 6 or more drinks are at a risk of 9 times greater risk for sexual aggression. Anybody have any idea why that is? If she's had 6 drinks or more, where's she at? She's at a bar. And so all kinds of things tend to ramp up when people start using their addiction for fun. And during this time, people begin to develop a condition called state-dependent learning. And what that means is that when they get in a particular zone after they drank to a certain level, if they learn certain activities, they probably can't do that same thing unless they're in the zone again. For instance, I heard a guy say one time, he said, I was a really good pool player, but never could play pool sober. Or another guy said, I could dance. My wife could dance at any time. I could dance after I had a few drinks. Now what happens in people is people tend to feed off one another, and social dependence develops, and folks will come around, they'll say something to a young man or young lady. They say, man, last night, you were so much fun. And what does that do? That encourages people to get back in that state again, because they've been encouraged to by friends. And the third phase is a phase of preoccupation, where the use of the substance or the event, the activity, becomes something that people think about all the time, and their use is normalized by people that they hang around with. And there's all kinds of people that will tell you today that addiction to this substance is not really wrong, or addiction to this behavior is not really wrong, and they'll encourage you that way. But that's what happens to people when they get involved in sinful behaviors. Phase 4 is the phase of addiction, and that is the time in which the tolerance level, the amount that a person can use, passes the trigger level, and they become an addict to that substance or to that behavior. And so addiction sets up in a person a spiral which is exceedingly difficult to escape. And the aspects of the spiral feed one another. Social dependence, enabling. A lot of people that are well-intentioned have a tendency to enable addicts to keep up their addiction to the substance or the activity. Take me up one more slide, please. A lot of people will develop a situation where they black out, and that will encourage their use because they do not remember things that had happened when they were addicted. And so it's a very hard thing for people to escape. Now here's the thing. As far as churches are concerned, people that love the Lord, people that want to do the right thing. Many people will say something like, well, I used to drink and I just quit it that one day and I laid it down and gave it all to Jesus, and I don't do that anymore. They were not addicts. What they mean is they drank and people got mad with them, but they were not addicts. Many well-meaning people don't understand the life of someone who has an addiction. What are we to say of professing Christians who are battling addiction? Take me up one more. It does not mean if a person has addiction to a substance or to an activity, it does not mean that person is lost. Recovery generally requires more than one element. And so people that are struggling with an addiction typically need more than one thing in their lives to help them on the journey. One more time. Either we believe that salvation is based on faith or we don't. The blood of Christ saves us from our sins. And as long as the blood of Christ is running through the veins of a person, they're saved. There are people that are struggling with addictions. They're actually children of God. They're not where they ought to be, but they're genuine believers because of the blood of Christ. I knew a man one time who had surgery on his neck, the carotid arteries, one of them. He saved the blockage. God to give it to him. It was about as large as my little finger. And he said that the doctors didn't understand how he had made it so long with that type of blockage. But the only thing they could figure is that there was just enough blood getting through to keep him alive. Is the blood of Christ running through your life today? You may be struggling with a sin. The blood of Christ can cleanse you of that sin. It can keep you alive. Let me share a story from Mark's Gospel. They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. We draw just a couple of things from this text. Number one, this man was infatuated with the dead. We live in a death culture. Everything's zombie this and zombie that and undead this and all the rest, television and all throughout our culture. One of the main things of tattoos of all kinds, and I don't care if you have a tattoo, that's fine. You know, I really don't care. One of the main things has to do with death, skulls and things like that. We live in a death culture with regard to that. This man was uncontrollable. People had tried to control him. They bound him. This man was awake night and day. Sounds like a meth addict to me. Guinness's Book of World Records will tell you that the longest time anybody has stayed awake without sleep is 11 days. I know meth addicts have been up 21 days. That's a long time. This man cut himself, which is a common release of tension. He was a cutter. This man knew that God was calling him to a different life, but he could not decide what to do. This man had many issues, and we call that in the psychological realm, we call those co-occurring disorders. And this man wanted to be free, and he didn't want to be free. Have you ever had a sin in your life that you wanted to get rid of, but there was a side of you that didn't want to get rid of it? That's typically the way they are, sinful behaviors. What are some strategies that might help with regard to the local church? First of all, as far as addicts are concerned, we need to understand but not enable addicts. The sins that you have and the sins that I have are the ways in which we express our sinful nature. And many churches do not understand addictions. Secondly, we can listen without judgment. We don't have to say everything we believe or say things as harshly as we feel. Being non-judgmental toward people does not mean refusing to make value judgments in life. But we don't have to be as hard on people as we are sometimes. Thirdly, we can identify honestly. There are some fine saints of God that have faced trials and addictions. And the best of us are living out our sinful natures. Fourthly, we can protect. And by that I mean we can shield sinners without absolving them. And I hope that at Faith Fellowship we will do that. We'll be a refuge. And by the way, stand by your friends. Always do that. Fifthly, we can promote. And by that I mean we can promote recovery groups. We can promote concerted life change and help other people that are on the roads of recovery. What is a struggle that you've got in your life? Your spiritual progress will always be uneven. And what Paul said? But what is the trajectory of your growth? Let's bow our heads. Father, I ask you to lay your hand on every life. And I know that struggles with sins are common, and being defeated is a common experience among Christian people that want to do well. And I pray that right now, Father, you would give comfort to that person who is hurting. Draw near to that person that needs your touch. As we lift our hearts in prayer to you, may we express to you the desires, the wants, the hurts, the needs of our souls. Will you come and touch each life as our heads are bowed, our eyes are closed. Lift our hearts to heaven. Father, meet the need of the one who is struggling today. Father, guide us as we go throughout the week. Reach down and touch us. We have to make decisions. Help us to have the mind of Christ. I pray, Father, that you will help us go forth from this place with a greater determination to live for you and a greater compassion for one another and for the lost. And these things we ask for Christ's sake. Amen. Would you stand with me, please? I'm delighted that you are here today. Next week, we're going to start talking about the road ahead. Please remember, midweek, be at 6:30 on Wednesday night. And also, the shower's coming up for Brooke and Levi, and that's going to be September 11th at 3 o'clock. And also, the books. If you could bring some, put them in this larger room behind the auditorium here, we'd appreciate that very much. Be much in prayer for the people that we have mentioned today. And we're going to repeat together the Aaronic Blessing. So would you join me? The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace.